Hi, this is Nichole of Wild Boho. Welcome to my studio.
I'm an embroidery and fiber artist who loves working with lots of color and beads. In this class, we'll be creating an embroidered crazy quilt, a faux crazy quilt, if you will. I'll teach you 5 embroidery stitches that are going to make up our background, as well as a few other stitches that we will use to embellish our projects with beads. This project is designed for every skill level, those new to embroidery or those who already know how to embroider. We'll go through every step together. So what do you say? Let's get stitching.
So let's talk supplies. The first thing you're going to need is an embroidery hoop. This could be wooden or plastic. I prefer wood hoops, but that is personal preference. And you're going to need a background fabric. We're using an 8-inch hoop, but your fabric, you don't need like tons of fabric. A fat quarter is plenty of fabric. You're going to need the pattern right here. The pattern is sized to fit the 8-inch hoop, but you'll see as we work through it, if you wanted to make this larger or smaller, it's fairly easy to convert the size of the pattern into the size of the project that you want to make. You are going to need embroidery needles. I use the Clover Gold Eye embroidery needles, sizes 3 through 9. It's nice to have a variety of sizes because there's a variety of hole sizes in the beads. For beading, I like to use, this is by Wonderfill Specialty Threads, and it is a 12 weight cotton. It's called Fruity, Fruitti, and I like that it matches my bead colors. You are going to need this is a water erasable marker. You can also use a chalk pen. You're just going to need something to mark your fabric, transfer the pattern from the paper to the fabric. And this is what I like to use. A pair of embroidery scissors, and then decide on your threads. So for my threads, I'm using this strand of beads for my color palette, and I chose threads that match the palette. So these are the DMC Cotton Redders Matte. You can find them either on DMC's website or they have them at several Michaels now. So they're easy to find in the store. So the colors that I'm using with this strand of beads are 2346, 2110, 2309, 2916, and 2718. So choose your color palette, your fabric. Some of the stitches are visible, or the fabric will be visible through the stitches. So choose a fabric that coordinates nicely. Here is the background. This is one of the backgrounds, and then I'm going to be stitching along the second background for our embroidered crazy quilt garden. So this is the faux crazy quilt that we're going to create with 5 embroidery stitches. So I'm going to be showing you the woven filling stitch, the chain stitch, the back stitch, the blanket stitch, and the lattice stitch right here. So there's several variations that you'll see on here, but with just those 5 stitches, we're going to fill in an area of our hoop. Now you'll see that I picked a yellow fabric for this one. And some of the stitches, you are going to see the fabric behind your stitches. So you want to pick something that matches with your beads. For this one, I wanted to create an ombre sort of effect, or like a faded effect that goes from the yellow to the purple to the blue, just like the one strand of Glass Garden beads. So think about your fabrics. You can use a printed fabric, like something with a design. You can use a solid fabric. Either way, choose something that you like working with, a color you like working with. You might want to pick your bead palette first and choose your fabric based on that. But for me, I'm going to show you, I'm going to start my stitch. For me, I chose yellow, and for the other hoop, I'm going to start teaching you each of the stitches and how to transfer your pattern onto that fabric. So let's get started. So to transfer your pattern, you are going to need the pattern and your fabric and a light source. Now I am using my light box. It's a wafer light pad by Daylight Company. And I'm just going to tape my pattern with washi tape just so it doesn't move, just at the corners. You can use a window. A window works just as well. If you have a light box, that works great too. So you just need a light source. And I'm going to switch this on, but then cover it with my fabric so the light doesn't drive you crazy. Okay, so I've chosen a fabric color that you can easily see the pattern. Sometimes when you do this and you're using a darker colored fabric, this part is a little trickier, but because I'm using a nice light colored fabric, you can see the pattern. I'm going to take my water erasable marker and I'm going to get a ruler. Again, you don't need a ruler. You can just freehand these lines, but I'm just going to make it easier on myself to use the ruler. So using this pen, I am just going to trace my lines and transfer them onto the fabric. This is a nice forgiving pattern. So you can either use this pattern exactly or you can change it around a little. And as we stitch, you can see just how forgiving of a pattern this is. It's simple enough that even if you don't get your lines perfectly straight, you're going to feel like you have a great project at the end, a great finished project. And again, resizing the pattern, very easy. You can either reduce the size of it on your printer, or you can just freehand your own lines and choose a different sized hoop. Just make sure that your fabric fits the hoop that you have. So you want to make sure you have the right amount of fabric. Okay, so I'm just going to finish these lines up and then we're going to put the fabric in the hoop. Okay, here's my transferred pattern, which just looks like a jumbled mess of lines. You'll notice I didn't copy the circle of the pattern onto this. I just chose the lines. You'll also notice that I didn't iron my fabric. That's because my fabric is going to be stretched in my hoop and these lines are going to come out. You absolutely can iron your fabric first. It's just a shortcut I sometimes take. I like to just get started with a project and sometimes ironing gets in the way. But if you want to iron your fabric before you transfer the pattern, go for it. It might drive you crazy to have little fabric folded lines. But you'll see at the end of the project, because I am stretching my fabric so much in the hoop, these lines all disappear. So you'll also see that my lines don't meet up exactly with the edges of the fabric. Also fine. I'm just going to go back and draw those lines. And I'm just going to freehand them. And then we're ready to get started. So I'm going to tighten my fabric, and I'm going to keep tightening this at the top. And I just like to make sure it's really tight in there before I cut it out of the fabric. So I just go all the way around several times to get any wrinkles out. And then I'm going to cut my fabric out, and I like to leave about 2 inches of fabric all the way around. You want some fabric so that you can continue tightening this as you are embroidering. You'll notice that your fabric does tend to loosen. So you want there to be enough that you can tighten it, but you don't want there to be so much that it goes behind your hoop and you end up stitching through it. That just gets annoying. So you're just going to cut yourself about 2 inches of fabric extra all the way around. And then we are ready to start our embroidery stitches. So you'll notice from the pattern that I have the woven filling stitch in 4 different areas. Now you can do the same exact woven filling stitch that I'm going to show you in this top section, or there's a lot of variety that you can create with this stitch. So I'm going to teach you the very basic, and then we'll talk about the different variations. Now, when I embroider, I normally recommend just starting with about a 12-inch piece of thread. However, for this stitch, I like to start with a little bit more because it just is easier to work with more thread in this stitch. This is also a stitch that uses up a decent amount of thread. I like to knot the end of my thread. Now, not everybody does that. That is a personal preference, but I just prefer to do it because if I don't knot it, I forget that it's not knotted and I pull my thread through and it drives me crazy. So I always knot the ends, and now I'm going to thread the thicker thread through the needle. Now this thread is not a divisible thread. It's meant to be used just as is. So it's not like the DMC floss that is 6 strands that can be divided up however you want it, from 1 to 6 strands. This you're going to use as is. It's also a great thicker thread to create our background of stitches here. So the woven filling stitch, I like to start in the middle. It's easier for me to get my lines straight and keep them straight if I start in the middle and work toward the edges. So I am just going to make a long stitch right here, pull all of my thread through. And as you're coming to the edge of the hoop, you can feel your needle doesn't want to go down because there's the wood of the hoop, but you can shimmy it down. You just kind of like push it. You only have to worry about this when we're really stitching towards the edges of the hoop. So you're just gonna, you kind of shift the fabric away a little bit to tuck your needle there and then pull your fabric through. Now, you know how I said that your fabric is going to move around while you stitch? You can see just like that, it moved around. So that's why I like to keep these edges here. And I am gonna see some of my pink fabric through. You get to decide how wide your stitches are. This is a woven stitch, which means we're gonna lay all of these, we'll call these the vertical stitches first, and then we're gonna go back through and weave the long horizontal stitches. So you can decide how far apart you want your stitches to be. And again, I'll show you the variations so that you can see the different things that you can do with this stitch. This is an excellent fill stitch. I love it. I use it a lot because it does fill a larger area pretty nicely. And so this is all I do. You're just going to keep eyeballing your stitches to make sure that they're consistently spaced. And sometimes it helps to just switch the position of your hoop to make sure that they are spaced the right way. So I'm going to continue working my way this way, and then I'm going to come back and work this way with these stitches. Okay, so there's half of my space that I wanted to fill. I did want to mention what I do when I've come to the end of my thread. So I still have some thread here that I can use. However, it's not enough to either stretch over here or cut it and start again. So what I like to do is just run this thread under a few of my stitches. And then I just do that 1 or 2 more times. If this is a heavily beaded section, I would be tying a knot, but because this is just the thread, I can still tie a knot if I want, just that simply. Because this is just the thread, I'm not super concerned about that coming undone, but I do like to know that it's secure. So now I'm going to cut another length of thread and start this side. So I have finished doing all of the stitches vertically, and now we are going to do the woven stitch. Now the finished stitch in this area will look like this. And I'm going to show you several different variations of this stitch, but the first one we're just going to work a very simple, you can see it's kind of close together, little squares that you see. So we're going to do that one first. Okay, so you can start wherever you want on this. I'm going to use this line down here as my guideline. And with your needle, if you have a tapestry needle, you can choose to use that here. Sometimes I have this is a doll maker's needle. Sometimes I'll use this because it's longer. The good thing about a tapestry needle is that the end is like blunt and not sharp, so it won't catch your threads as you're going through. If you don't have one, you can, like this is a doll maker's needle. The needle is sharp, but I like the length of it for going through like this much of a woven area. So if you only have a sharp needle, you can take your needle over and under with just the eye of the needle because that's not sharp, and so that will not catch your threads. Or you can just do it regularly and just be really careful with your threads. I do that a lot if I'm working a larger area and only have a shorter tapestry needle. So I'm going to just try it the regular way right now. So just pick either start going over or start going under, but you're going to go over and under each one of these stitches, just like you are weaving something. All of these stitches will be worked on top of the fabric. You can see that a doll maker's needle does help, because if you were using a shorter needle at this point, you would need to pull your thread through. So I got through about more than halfway with this needle. But again, a shorter needle will work just fine. And just continue going over and under. Now this is a woven stitch, so the next stitch that you're going to do is going to be the opposite of this. And then we have one under this teeny tiny little stitch here. Okay, so I'm going to pull my thread all the way through. The nice thing about a woven stitch, you can see my stitch looks kind of a mess right now. So with my other needle, or just with this needle, you can just push the stitches into place. So I just kind of gently move my stitches. You can pull it again and just kind of, you really only have to do this with the first stitch. You can also use your finger. You just want to get your first few stitches in the right place, and then the others will all start falling into line. So I'm just going to make sure this is good. And then when it is, I'm going to just get these two little ones down here. The little end doesn't want to work. Okay, so I'm going to take my needle down through the fabric. I know I said this is a stitch that's worked above the fabric, but at the end of each woven row, you are going to have to take your thread underneath the fabric and then bring it up again. And so now I'm going to start on this side because my thread is over here, and I'm just trying to maximize my thread usage, because I did say this stitch likes to eat up a lot of your threads, and it's right on the edge, so it's a little tricky in this area. Okay, so my thread is back up. Now I didn't decide to go under this stitch because it's a really short stitch, so I'm going to start here, and I'm going to do the opposite of what I did before. So this stitch I have going under, so now I'm going to go over it, and I'm just going to do exactly the opposite. And if you get mixed up and forget as you're going through, it's easy enough to just pull your thread out. No problem at all. And that's about as far as I can get. So I'll take my thread through. And then I'll just continue. So even though this isn't a tapestry needle, my threads are not getting caught on the needle too badly. Okay. So here's my second row, and you're gonna wanna do the same thing. You know what, I might use my scissors just to push these in place. It's a little bit easier. Just decide how far apart you want your rows to be. And you'll notice right away if you made any mistakes, because if you went over and under one way and then over and under the other way, and it's not the opposite, you'll see that your stitches will just want to line up right next to each other. This way, there's definitely a space there. They don't want to get too close to each other. So there we have that. I'm going to take it under, and I think I can get one more row with this thread. And I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep about this much space in between my next row, and I'm going to keep moving all the way up to the top of the hoop. And then we will work on another variation of this stitch. So here is my section of the woven filling stitch, all stitched up. When you're finishing your threads, you're gonna just do the winding your threads back through a few stitches. You can tie a knot, you don't have to tie a knot. Because this is not beaded, I don't really need to tie knots on this area, but you definitely do that if you feel more comfortable with it. So with the pattern, the next area of woven filling stitch that we're going to be doing is right here. So on my finished hoop, you can see with my threads, I did kind of an ombre look. I started with the very lightest yellow, moved into some darker yellows, into the lighter purples, the darker purples, the blues through my hoop. With this hoop, because I have 5 different colors, I am using the same thread for each, the same color thread for each stitch area. So what I mean by that is in the pattern, you'll see that there's several areas of woven filling stitch. I'm going to use the same thread color for each of those just to see how this version turns out. So the woven filling stitch here is slightly different than the one here. You can see it's more of an open weave, and I did 2 stitches together. So this example here, we did 1 stitch all the way across the same distance apart from each other, and then 1 going the opposite direction. With this one, my foundation stitches were 2 at a time, and I kept them a little bit more open. It almost looks like a nice basket weave pattern. You can do that. You can also decide if you really like this, just do another section of this. Maybe make it a little different by spacing your stitches out. Or you can have fun with another variety of the woven filling stitch. So I'm going to start this one the same way. Again, I like to start in the middle. It just helps me to gauge my space and my stitches. And so I'm going to start with 2 stitches, and I'm going to be going in this direction from the middle here to the outer edge of the hoop. And because I'm working right up to the very edge of the hoop underneath, I just have to be, these first stitches, if you're working along the edge of the hoop, are always a little bit trickier. So then my other stitch, I'm going to make sure it lines up and lays nicely next to this stitch. So these create like a thicker line, but because we're spacing them further apart, they just have more, it has more of an open look. So now my next 2, and just pick a width that you want to keep your stitches apart, and then try and eyeball it and stay with that. So I'm going to do it right about here. I'm going to keep laying these foundation stitches, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to do the same exact thing in the opposite direction. So I have my vertical lines here in pairs of 2, and now I'm going to do the same exact thing that I did in our other section, and I'm just going to start down here at the very corner of this section, and I'm going to do the over under over under. The only difference this time will be that I'm going to, when I finish this row, I'm going to do the same exact thing but with a line right next to it, because remember, I'm doing these in close rows of 2 each. And so I just want to make sure that this is pressed all the way down. And I can always straighten that up later, but I want to try and get it in place before I do my next row. And my next row is right here. So I'm bringing it up nice and tight, and I'm doing the same exact thing. So with this way, we varied. Each row was over, under, and then under, over. Because these 2 rows are kind of the same thing, I'm doing the same thing for this one. So I'm just following exactly what I did for the previous row with the weaving, because I want these 2 to seem as if they're the same row. Just like that. I can press them nice and tight. And then I'm going to take my thread down through the back of the fabric. And so my next row, I'm going to, I have enough thread. I'm going to, remember I wanted more spacing, so I'm going to bring it up about here. Just kind of eyeball the space that you want. I like to just make sure I'm going, in the right direction. And now I'm going to do the opposite. So I'm going to check out what I previously did and do the opposite overs and unders. It's really simple when you get started with this, and there's such a variety of stitches that you can do. And I'm just going to keep doing this. So now there are 2 more sections of woven filling stitch. We have this one right here where I did, these are in sections of 3. So it still looks like a basket weave, but it's a little bit thicker than this one just because there's more lines of thread. And then this one, I did it the same way that we did this top one, only I left more spacing in between each row. So experiment with that in your next 2 sections. If you really like the look of how this looks or this looks and you just want to continue that down here, by all means do that. So I'm going to finish up my last 2 sections and we'll move on to the next stitch. So here is my finished woven filling stitch sections. You can see each one with this same exact stitch, the variety that you can create, which is a lot of fun. So it's a great way to practice stitches and also to think about the variety in your stitches. So now we are going to move on to the lattice stitch. Now you can see that here in this section. Let's see, we also have it right here. I think there might just be 2 lattice stitch sections. I am going to work that. Oh, I did want to mention the amount of thread that you get for your project. It might be helpful to pick up 2 skeins of each color. This is all the thread that I have left from these 4 stitches. And I was very, very careful with how I used it because I felt like I was coming down to the end and I didn't know that I was going to have enough. I did, fortunately. But if you're working on a bigger project or yours might not be as spaced out as mine are, you definitely would need more than just 1 skein of this. So on to the lattice stitch. So the lattice stitch is a laid stitch. It's not woven like the woven filling stitch is, which means that all of our stitches are going to be worked on top of the fabric, and we're basically laying the thread down. So I'm going to start, by moving this thread away. I'm going to start by laying down my diagonal rows, and this is another stitch where everybody's section will look different because you can do different widths. You get to choose how far apart your lines are going to be. It's going to look a lot like the woven filling stitch at first when you lay all of your rows down. And I'll show you how. I'm going to finish this up and then I'll come back and lay the other rows. So here are my diagonal rows, and you can see it starts out a lot like the woven filling stitch. I'm going to, let's see, which direction do I want to do these? I think I'm just going to follow this line, that blue line there, for the rest of my stitches. And instead of, let's see, I'll start right about here. Instead of weaving these stitches, you'll notice that the main difference is I am just laying the thread down, just like that, and taking it through to the other side. Now there will be a third step, because you'll notice as you stitch that even though you're laying thread over other thread, it's still like loosely coming off of the fabric, and it doesn't look finished. So I'm going to just lay all of these rows, and you can see how quickly it works up. But then we'll move on to the third step of this stitch. Okay, so my stitches are all here. Now you'll notice as you are stitching this that your threads will move around a little bit, and the third step is what secures them. So I've kind of moved this one is the only one that's giving me a little trouble and not staying where I wanted it to stay, but we're going to take care of that. So I like to start with an area down at the edge, and I am bringing my thread up, and I'm going to just make a little stitch diagonally over where the two threads cross. This is the stitch that's going to secure this down. And as I do this row of stitches along here, that's what's going to keep this in place then. So before I stitch each one, I can just make sure it's where it should be, and then just bring it up and make a small, it's almost like you're making half of a cross stitch, which that is another variation on this stitch. You could make, it doesn't have to be just one stitch. You could go and make little X's randomly throughout it. As long as you have a few stitches holding down these threads, you don't need something on every single stitch. If you wanted to do larger cross stitches and it would only work to have 1 or 2 per row, you could definitely do that. So this is another stitch that there's a lot of variety in how you secure it to the fabric. And so you can have fun with that. So I'm going to keep going with this. And then I'm going to start the other lattice work area, which is, let me check my pattern. I believe it is this section right here. And looking at this stitch, this is, let's see, where am I working right now? I'm working up in this corner right now. Oh, and what I did in this corner is varied where the stitches met. So that was just a variation that I made. With the next section that I'm going to make, I'm going to start it exactly the same way. And then I'm just going to do my little dashes over the 2 threads. So I'm going to fill up these 2 rows, or these 2 sections, with the lattice stitch. Here is my finished lattice stitch. So you can see up here where I just did the one little cross over each of the 2 threads meeting. And then down here, I switched things up a little and decided to do the cross stitch. So you can see it's not on every single one. And I did vary where they are, but the thread is nice and secure. It's not going anywhere. But I think it just, I mean, it's a neat look to have different, and when you look at it from far away, you're not going to notice much of a difference no matter what you do, but it's when you sit and look at it closely that you see the little details. And so that's why I like these stitches to vary things up in the background. We are going to work on the chain stitch. I have a chain stitch section here and here, and on the finished hoop, this is what it looks like. So we have the section right here and right here. It's a nice dense stitch, and it can be used as a fill stitch, or you can add chain stitching. Once you know how to chain stitch, it's just nice to add in. You could make lines, vines, like it can handle curves well. But I do like to use stitches in different ways, and I think you don't always see the chain stitch as a fill stitch, so I kind of thought it would be fun to add that here. So I knot the end of my thread just like normal, and this is a stitch where you're just going to pick a spot to start, and I'm going to start right here. Now the first stitch that I'm going to make is just a very small anchor stitch, so it's kind of like a back stitch or a straight stitch. And you only need to make this stitch when you are beginning a row or beginning your chain. Now I'm going to come up right about here. So you can see it's a little further down from that stitch. And then I'm going to go under that first stitch that I just made. Pull my thread all the way through, and I'm going to go back down where I just came up in the same spot. So that is my first chain. Now my next stitch, I'm going to bring my thread up. Oops, and I caught a little bit of, sometimes when you have a lot of threads on the back, you can sometimes pull a little bit of it up with your thread, which happens a lot. Okay, so now instead of going under our little anchor stitch, I'm going under both strands of the chain stitch that I just made. So just taking my needle, passing right under that and pulling through. And then going down right where I came up. And again, I used a long piece of thread here just because I didn't feel like stopping and starting. I took a little shortcut, but sometimes that means I have to unravel or unwind my thread a little bit more because it likes to like roll up. So now every other stitch is going to follow this pattern. You're going to go under the previous stitch as you make your new stitch. I'm going to keep working on this, and then I'll show you what happens when we get to a corner area, like right here. Okay, so I've finished my line of stitching, and now I've come down to this section, and I need to be going down this way next because I'm going to work the whole outer part and then just keep working towards the inside. So the way I handle this is, if it were a curve, it would be easy to just continue your stitching without it looking weird, because this can travel along a curve really well. Because this is a really tight corner, what I'm going to do is my last chain stitch for this row, and then I'm going to restart the chain stitch. Now I might not have to do, and when I say restart the chain stitch, I mean I'm just going to start with another little anchor stitch that's just going to get buried in among the chain stitches. You're not going to notice that that looks a little different. Again, if it was a wider sort of angle, I could continue with my chain stitching, depending on, you don't want it to like pull your threads and make them look like wonky. So if I was able to continue my line of chain stitches like that, I would. But because this is a really tight little corner, I'm just going to start a brand new row and then continue just like this. So I'm going to work this area and also this narrow strip right here. Now this seems like a very simple stitch, and it is. It's a great basic stitch to know. It will take a little bit of time to fill in this area because you are going in and out of the fabric. It's not a laid stitch like like the trellis stitch. Did I say trellis? Lattice? I always do that. But it is going to take a little bit of time. So put on some music and just relax while you stitch the chain stitch. Well, here are my 2 finished sections of the chain stitch. You'll notice that when this is all stitched up, it's definitely a heavier looking section of this, which is why as I designed this pattern, I do have it so that there are more dense sections of stitching, but also more open ones. And as you're stitching it, if you decide you want yours to feel either more dense or more open, you can absolutely vary these previous stitches that we did, and you can change the look of this pattern. So now we're going to move on to the back stitch. You'll see there are 1, 2, I think there's a third one, maybe just 2 sections of back stitch in here. And here's what they look like on the actual hoop. Here's one section and here's another section. Now again, this is another stitch that this one I allowed there to be a little bit more background poking through the stitch, and this one it's closer together. So another stitch that you can really vary as a fill stitch. So this is going to be our first area of back stitch. And just like all the other stitches, you can pick where you want to get started. You can have your stitch running in this direction, in this direction. I'm going to have mine running up and down this way, because both of these are going in the same direction. So I want it to feel, even though it's going to definitely feel like a different stitch, I want it to be noticeably different in shape. So let's see. I am going to start down at this corner. This is a great, very simple, very basic stitch that you will find yourself using in embroidery, no matter what sort of embroidery you're doing. So you can decide your stitch length. I'm going to make my stitches all about that long. So I've made my first stitch, and now I'm coming ahead of the stitch and I'm working back to where I just stitched. Now you can either go back down in the same spot, or you can leave like a little space in between the stitches. I like to do mine that way. I just like the look of it. You just make sure you're not going down through the knot of your thread if you're just getting started. So you can see, looking close, I mean, you'd have to look very, very close, but there's a very small gap of space there. And you're just working back to each of your previous stitches. Simple, but when it works up as a fill stitch, it just looks very cool. It has a nice flat appearance on the fabric, and the rows just make it look really nice. So I'm going to keep stitching up my sections of back stitch, and when we come back, we'll only have 1 stitch left to add to our sampler. So here is our finished back stitch sections, and we have 3 sections to go. So the next stitch that we are going to work on is the blanket stitch. So here are my 3 finished sections of blanket stitch. We have right here, and right here. So in this one, I used each of the little squares that we created to add beads. And in both of these, I stitched over them. So we'll get to that after we actually learn the stitch. So I'm going to start in this area right here. And I'm going to be working from left to right. I'm going to start by bringing my thread up at this corner. Now you'll see I still have some blue lines that might be visible depending on how thick this stitch is. You can see there's still some here. If you finish your hoop and you still have a few blue stitch or blue pen lines, or even chalk lines if you were using the chalk, what I do is just take a little Q-tip and some water, and I'll just run over a few of those, and they will disappear. You do want to be careful with having water touch your threads, and you'd want to make sure that they are color fast, which the threads that I'm using are color fast. Sometimes I've used a thread that isn't color fast, and as I'm like trying to get my lines away, you can see the color of the thread start blending into my fabric. So just verify that it's color fast. If it's not and you have a few little marks, maybe we can cover them up with beads and nobody will be any the wiser if that happens. Okay, so I'm going to bring my needle and thread up just at this corner here. I'm going to be working from left to right, and I'm going to try and hold this. It's a little awkward when it's in this section over here. So I'm going to be making rows that kind of run as if they're going up. So I'm just going to start a row. I'm going to determine the size of my lines, and as you work with this stitch, it will become a little easier to create rows with boxes that are consistent in size. This one can take a little getting used to create those consistent boxes. And I'm just going to pull through. Okay, so there's my first stitch. So I'm bringing my needle and I'm leaving my thread up along here, taking my needle and thread into and out of the fabric. And I'm making sure that I go over this thread right here. And then I'm going to pull my thread all the way through. Again, I've used a lot of thread for this one because I'm going to be working a big section and I don't want to be threading and unthreading my needle. So this stitch here that you're making is almost like anchoring your thread in place. So you're going all the way up to where you want your top line to be, and you're going to make sure that you've just slipped your thread underneath that needle, and then we're going to pull all the way through. And I'll show you one more. Okay, so my thread is up. I'm going to make another line with my needle. Okay, so it's going in and over, or it's going in the fabric and then above the fabric. You're tucking your thread behind the needle and pulling through. If I wanted to end my row of stitches here, like I'll be doing when I get all the way over here, I would just take my needle and thread down at this point, and it would tuck a little stitch right there and everything would stay in place. So I'm going to finish this row and then I'll show you how we start this second row here. So I finished my first row, but I want to show you what your two options are for the second row. So you can see here when I was working this bottom section, each of my lines do not line up. They're not one right under the other. With this one, my lines, for the most part, line up and they make like perfect squares right on top of one another. And these, the squares are a little offset from each other. So I'm going to do the offset version again here as I work my next row. So I'm going to start it the same exact way. I'm going to bring my needle and thread up, and I'm just going to be creating a new row right here. Now, if I wanted to create the little sections directly under these, I would bring my needle and thread right up under this stitch and just create my new rows there, and then it would look like a checkerboard. Because I want to make sure they're a little offset, I'm going to start this one right about here. And I'm taking my needle and thread up to make a new row. So I'm making this stitch exactly the same. And instead of running along this row of back stitches, I'm just running along my row of stitches that I just created. And these stitches I'm just going to offset and make sure they don't line up perfectly one under the other. For my other section, I'm probably going to make sure they do line up perfectly one under the other, just to give it a little variety. So you can see that's how it's going to start to look. So I'm going to finish all three sections of the blanket stitch, and then we'll look at our finished backgrounds of our hoops. Well, here is my finished background, or layer 1, if you want to call it that. I think it is a good, if you followed kind of the same pattern and like the same spacing and everything, I think it's a good breakup of colors. I said that I had wanted to do this one not quite as ombre. I'm still using like the same color families, but this one was more the yellows into the purples into the blue. And I like both. I don't know that I can pick a favorite. I think I'll have to see when I actually get to adding the beads and everything, but it was fun to try both ways. And so now I'm going to take you back in time a little bit to before this one was completely embellished. I'm going to show you what the second layer looks like with the embellishments, and then we're going to talk about adding rickrack to our hoops. So we have finished our first layer of embroidery stitches, and next we're going to work on the second layer. That is what you see here, the little trims and bits of things that we've added to the embroidery. Now, this is optional. We're going to be doing a lot of bead work, and so you don't have to do this part if you don't want to, but I'm going to show you just how I'm going to add a few things to the piece that we just stitched to create our second layer of embroidery. So rickrack is just a trim or ribbon that you can find on Etsy. You can find them in craft stores, fabric stores. It's this pretty decorative trim, and there are different widths. I have these really pretty ones that I picked up ages ago that I don't want to use up completely, that have some embroidery on them. And then you're not limited to just rickrack. There are other trims that you can look at. I just always collect little bits of trim. I love this scalloped edge here. It's fun to mix this in with beads and embroidery because it just adds another layer to your embroidery. So I'm going to show you how simple it is. You can use thicker trims like this. This is the part where you really just get to play around and see what look you like on your hoop. I'm going to show you the basic way to add rickrack to some of your seams here, and then we'll get started on another 2 embroidery stitches that you can layer on top of this before we add all of the beads. So when you look at a crazy quilt embroidery like this, or just a crazy quilt that's quilted, your eye wants to travel along the piece, and that's what your goal should be. So we want our eyes to kind of travel through the hoop. And so when I'm placing my trims, I kind of think, how do I want my eye to be drawn down this hoop? There are so many options. You could take a piece like this and say, I just wanted to follow some of these lines. I could do something like this. I'll actually show you with a few different pieces. It just breaks up your stitching a little bit, adds a little bit more color, visual interest, and you don't have to just follow these lines. If I wanted to do something completely different, I could have my trim going like that. I might actually do something a little bit like that with some of these trims. So you just kind of want to have your eye travel through the hoop. So I'm going to decide which section I want this piece of rickrack on, and then we're going to grab our 12 weight thread, whatever thread you're using, and our needle, and we're going to stitch it down. So I've looked at my hoop, I want to have this color up here because it kind of goes with this color. I just want to break up the darker colors up here. And so I've cut my rickrack, and I'm just going to put it like right at the edge. Now, when I'm stitching this on, I know that I'm going to be coming back again and adding the third layer of beads. So I'm just going to make sure that every so often I have a little stitch that is securing this down, and it's just a little straight stitch. And I'm just coming up through the background fabric onto my rickrack and down again. And I'm going to go down one side and then back the other side and just do small stitches every time it like dips here. Now, if you feel like you want to add more stitches, by all means do that. This is going to be good for me because I know I am coming back to add more stitches. So this is just going to keep everything in place until I know what my finished piece is going to look like and what more I want to add where. So I'm just going to keep doing this. It's the same way with your other ribbons. You just need small little stitches to secure it down, to secure each piece down. And you can see it's staying good there. And I'm still going to come back and I'm going to do those sides too. So that's all it is. It's just playing around with the colors, with the textures. You can have different thicknesses of trim. And you don't have to cover up every seam either. I'm just adding little strips of color where I feel like my hoop could use a little bit of color and shape. So I'm going to keep doing that. Go ahead and do yours, and then I'm going to come back, show you what we have before we add some more embroidery. Well, here is my layer 2 all finished. You can see I did overlap some of the trims that I was thinking about. I did some overlapping here. I feel like it kind of pulls your eye through the whole hoop, which is exactly what I wanted. I used some of the same trims just so it kind of echoes the same colors throughout. Yeah, so I'm really happy with how this turns out. And I think we are ready now to start on layer 3, the embellishment and the beading. So I have a collection of absolutely stunning beads to use with this hoop. This is the strand that I kind of chose my colors from. I loved the purples, the reds, and that's kind of where I chose this color palette. So in going with that, I'm using this color palette of these beads with my threads that I've picked to do any little embroidering on here. So I've got like the teal that's in there. I've got this yellow color. I had another strand right here that has some orange in it. So these threads are by Wonderful Specialty Thread. They're Eleganza Pearl Cotton. So a pearl cotton means that you can just pull it right from the spool and use it exactly as is. It's kind of like the other thread where it's not divisible. You can get it in different weights. So these two are both, the purple are both a size 5. This is a size 8. And then there's a thicker one that's a size 3. So this is the thinnest, this is the middle, and then there's a size 3, which I'm not going to use because I already have a lot of really thick threads. And I want to just add to that plus use beads. So I think I'm good with these two weights of threads. So the first stitch we're going to look at is the feather stitch, which you can see I have running throughout the hoop. I kind of interspersed it throughout all of the beads. Now on this hoop, I did place these larger floral beads first. Just because I wanted to gauge where everything was going to go. But I don't always recommend that because these are larger beads. They stick off of the fabric, and the whole time you're stitching anything on here, you're going to be catching your threads on these beads, which is kind of a pain and annoying. So I definitely suggest putting the feather stitch down first, which is what we are going to do now. What I love about the feather stitch is that it is a wandery sort of stitch, and it's a great stitch for adding beads. So if I wanted to stitch a whole length of feather stitch and then come back and add, I think actually these beads would be perfect. I'm going to be adding these beads throughout my feather stitch. So it's great for that. I'm going to start up here and kind of work over these trims here and kind of, I think, go down to here. And I'm going to bring some other strands down that way as well. So how we get started, we're bringing our thread up And we're going to take it off to the side. Now, I'm not staying exactly even with this spot. I'm going to go down a tiny bit. And I'm not pulling all the way through. My thumb is going to catch the thread, and I'm bringing my needle up again right under this. I'm going to call this the middle line because as I work it, we're going to be alternating sides from the middle to the right to the left, okay? So we're bringing it up in the middle, and now I can let go of that thread because this is going to anchor it down. So now I'm going to go to the left of that line, just bringing it down slightly lower than my previous line, using my thumb to catch the thread here. As I bring my thread up again, my needle up in the middle. As I'm stitching this one, I'm always telling myself that I'm coming up in the middle and down on the sides. I don't know why that helps me, but it just helps me keep track of where I am in the stitch process. So if I'm ready to go down, it means I'm going down on a side. And I'm going to alternate here. This is also a stitch that if I wanted to keep going off to the sides, or if I wanted to stay just on the right side, if I wanted to stay just on the left side, it's a really great stitch to just kind of vary where you're taking it. And I'll show you that here. So instead of going down onto the left, I'm going to go a little bit further onto the right side. And now when I come up in the middle, this is my new middle. It's going to line up with this row rather than this row. So I'm going to bring it up right about here. Now I'm coming through layers, but it didn't seem to bother my needle. So now you can see it, instead of just going in a straight line down, I'm working over a little bit. I'll do that one more time. I'm going to go further to the side and bring my needle up again in this new middle that I'm creating. And you see my thumb's always just catching this thread. I don't want to pull it all the way through yet. Now to get it back over to where I originally was, I'm just going to slowly work over there. So I'm going to take my needle down and I'm going to come up even with this section here. So that's what I mean about this being a wandery stitch. You can have fun with this one and really just let yourself go all over the place. You could do different sections of it, different colors of it. I love that it really does look like flower vines when you're stitching it, which makes it a great stitch for adding beads to the ends. And that's something that I'm going to do when all of my feather stitches laid. I'm going to come back and add beads to the end of each of, not all of them, but like little sections. I'm going to add beads. So I'm going to keep working this all throughout my hoop in different areas. When I want to end this stitch, I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to do just a few more so that I don't waste all this thread. You can see I'm going just fine through all the trim. So your trim really is your second layer, and this stitching is just working up right on top of the trim, which makes it all feel like it's a cohesive arrangement then. Okay, so if I'm here and I want to end this stitch, I'm going to take my thread down so that this stitch is being anchored. And it's just secured right like that. So I wind my thread through my last few stitches and I can pick it up and start in another section. I can choose another color. So that's what I'm going to keep doing. Here is my feather stitch. So you can see I added 5 little sections of it throughout here. I can always go back and add more once I've added my beads, if I see any areas I want to fill in with that stitch. So this is just my foundation of this. So I want to show you one more stitch before we move on to the beads, and that is the lazy daisy. So in here, you can see that I've added small lazy daisies, and also here along the rickrack, I've added 3 lazy daisies to each little section. So I'm going to show you here how I'm going to add them to this section of rickrack. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of these little green leaves, the little green beads that look like leaves. I think I might put one at each section here and then do like a larger lazy daisy to make it look like a little flower. And I might even do a double lazy daisy, which is a very easy variation on that. So I'm just going to start right here with my first little dip in the rickrack. I'm going to bring up my thread. Now I can either do it on the rickrack or on the background. You can decide. I might bring it up on the rickrack for this one. So I'm just bringing my thread and needle up, and then I kind of just hold it to the side with my thumb as I take it right back down into the same hole, and I'm not going to pull it all the way through. This is kind of like the feather stitch when you don't want to pull it all the way through yet. And then when I bring my needle up, that determines how large this stitch is going to be. So if I wanted a really long one, I would bring it up about here, and then that's how long my stitch would be. I actually think I kind of like that length, so I'm going to do it that length. So I'm going to pull my needle and thread through. Now that has anchored the stitch, and so to finish that, I'm just going to take my needle down, and you can see that your stitch is now anchored here. So I'll show you one more time how to do that, and then I'll also show you how easy it is to make this single lazy daisy a double lazy daisy. So I'm bringing my needle and thread up through the rickrack. I hold it off to the side as I take my needle down in that same hole. I'm not pulling it all the way through, and I'm going to decide my stitch length. So once I've decided that, and I pull my needle through, that secures the stitch there. And then I just make a small stitch on the outside of that. I take it down, and that secures it. So now if I wanted to make this a double lazy daisy, I'm going to do the same exact thing, only inside of this stitch. So I'm bringing my needle up and down. And now when I decide the length of this stitch, it's going to be somewhere within that first lazy daisy that you've made. So it's the same exact stitch, just one inside of the other. And you can see that makes it, you can see it a little better. With so much going on here, it does stand out better. Plus, I'm using a thinner thread. These thicker threads still kind of show through, which I think really looks neat on this. So I'm going to go through and add lazy daisies to all of this. And then I'm going to finish this embroidery. I'm going to decide, are there any other spots where I want lazy daisies or double lazy daisies? You can add them to the end of your feather stitch. I'm not doing that yet because I am going to go back and add beads throughout this. So finish your stitching, add your feather stitches, your lazy daisies throughout the hoop, and then we're going to come back and finish up with the beading. Okay, so here are my finished lazy daisies, double lazy daisies, and I added some here too. I also added them, you can make lazy daisies in the shapes of actual flowers or daisies. So I added those throughout here so that my eyes kind of, when you look at this, you see them throughout, which again, the idea with a crazy quilt, and this is like our faux embroidered crazy quilt, is for your eye to pass through the whole thing and focus on little things as you move through it. So I think we are ready for some beads. Stitching with beads is fairly simple and really fun when you get started with it. So I am just going to empty a few of these strands because I wanted to get the green leaves off of this strand. So I'm just going to put the whole thing into my bead tray. And then as I'm working on this, I can decide what I want to put where. And I think we're also going to cut this really pretty. I love this strand. Remember, I said I wanted to add these throughout here. So those are the first two definites I know I'm going to use. So I'm going to be using my 12 weight thread. I'm using a yellow just because I don't mind if I see it through the beads and it coordinates with everything that I'm using here. So I'm going to start with this area right here where I wanted to add the little green shapes, just like that. So I'm bringing my needle up and then I'm going to put the bead on it. And then I'm just going to take my needle and thread down. I'm going to make sure this is exactly where I want it to be. And then I just take it down through the fabric. And there we go. Sometimes with larger beads, I might go through a second time just so that I feel like they're really secure on the fabric. And if you do that, you just want to make sure that your needle and thread are thin enough that they can go through the whole of the bead several times. So there's my little leaf with the flower. I'm going to continue adding those to this part, but let me show you how I'm going to add these little oranges or persimmons to the feather stitch. So let's see, I'm going to add one right about here. And again, I'm bringing my needle up through the fabric. I'm going to pop my little bead on there, on the needle, string it through, and then I just have to figure out where it's going to lay nicely. And then take my needle and thread down through the fabric, just like that. And again, because this one is a little bit heavier of a bead, I wouldn't do this with seed beads. The heavier, pretty accent beads, I do like to go through twice just because there's a lot of weight to the bead and it just makes me feel like it is on here much more securely. And then I wanted to add one of these little leaves, which have the holes right there on the side. And let's see, I think that looks really cute, like right about there. Unless I wanted to add it over here. No, I think I'm going to add it to the other side. So I'm going to just bring my needle up again. Put the bead on the needle. And with a bead like this, you just want to make sure that it's going to lay where you want it to lay. And when you're happy with the placement of it, just take your needle back down again to secure it, which is absolutely adorable. You can see it has some dimension to it. That is really, really cute. What an adorable little bead. So I'm going to go through and add several more of these. I'm going to add some of these little mushrooms. I'm not sure if I'm just going to use the pink ones or the red and white ones or a little mixture of both. I might add like a little mushroom patch down here. I like the red of that. I don't want to overpower this with red, but it does echo the red from these other sections. And I like to a lot of times work in odd numbers with beads if I'm doing like little clumps, or the same with like little flowers. Like I have 5 flowers along here. That's just something I like to do. So I feel like it kind of looks better when it's like an odd number. So I have some of those that I might add in. I also have, these have such a cool texture too. They remind me of like the shape of little pears. And the colors, I definitely want to add these because this is the whole reason I chose these colors for the threads in here. So I'm going to add them throughout. I also have some of these flower shapes. I have two different flower shapes. I'm going to add these cup-shaped ones, which you can also see that I added into this hoop. I have a lot of the cup-shaped beads throughout here. With the mushrooms, I added them along the rickrack, which is really fun if you have like a lot of rickrack on yours. There are butterflies. I have these cute little crab-shaped beads here if I want to add those. And then there were beads that I could make up a flower with. So I could use one of the flower-shaped beads and then add little petals. So I have these tiny little petals here, and I have a different shaped petal here, and then one more here. So I'm just gonna have fun creating some flower shapes too with the different colors, just like I did here. I stacked one of the flower centers with another bead, and then just kind of like created my little flower shapes throughout the hoop. Added some butterflies in here. So this is the part where you really just can have fun with the beads. Use this as inspiration, come up with your own ideas in mixing the colors. And when I finish this up, I will show you what I've done with my beading, and then we will completely finish the hoop. I'll show you how we cut our fabric and secure the fabric in the back to have a finished project. Well, you can see all of the sparkle as it catches the light, but I am finished this embroidery hoop. And I have to say, I feel like I almost like this version better than this version. But now that I look at them that way, I don't know. I don't think I can pick favorites. These are my babies. So let's talk about this hoop for a minute. You can see that along the feather stitch, I added those little pieces of, they remind me of fruit, like lemons and oranges with the little leaves. I added them throughout. I kept that all the same throughout because I feel like it does echo nicely. Even though you're not noticing it exactly, you're noticing that the same elements are carried through the hoop. I also did the same thing here with the double lazy daisies, the rickrack, and the beads that I did here. So again, two other things I kind of carried through. When there's a lot going on in the hoop, it is nice to carry a few things like I had done with the rickrack, keeping the same colors throughout just to pull the eye, and you can see that it is a cohesive piece then. And when you have a lot going on, it's nice to bring things in that feel cohesive. So down here, this is one of my favorite parts. This is where I combined several of the beads to make flowers. Remember those bead shapes that I was showing you that were shaped like petals? I added some of these in to almost look like leaves or parts of the flower petal, and again to bring some of this color down here. There's the mushrooms that I talked about adding. I did another little clump of flowers here with combining several beads together and stacking them. When you're stacking the beads, you're going to bring your needle through. So for this one, I brought my needle through the big flower, the smaller center, and the top bead. And then when I want to secure it, I'm taking my needle back down again through just the center bead and the largest bead. Not taking it through this one again secures it in place and holds that all together. So I think that I am ready to finish up this hoop and move on to the finishing step. You'll see the back of this hoop. This is what a finished hoop for me looks like. You can see that the fabric is all nicely tight around here. I don't have all of this excess here. So to get started doing that, I like to give my hoop one final tighten. So I go through the whole thing and I'm just tightening the fabric, making sure that it is in place because as you stitch, you're going to notice that, especially with heavy beads and stuff, your fabric is going to want to, it just gets like not as tight in the hoop. So then I give the hoop another tighten, and I always just do it one more time just to make sure I'm not missing any sections. And when I'm sure that it's tight, I give it another tighten. I grab my scissors and I am going to trim. I don't want this much. So when you look at the back of your hoop, you don't want to, you're going to be folding your fabric over. You don't want so much excess fabric here that it's touching this fabric. So you want to trim enough away so that it folds over the wooden part, but doesn't touch this fabric. So it's always good to leave too much rather than too little. So if you're not sure, give it a little trim and see, am I on the right track? That's about what I want to see. I want this purple to cover up that wooden hoop there. So I'm good. I'm going to trim and leave just about, it's like maybe half an inch, maybe a little more than 1/4 of an inch. I don't want to say an exact measurement because I want you to just feel what it looks like. I never measure this part. I always just eyeball it. So once you know what it looks like, it'll be easier to do this the next time. So I trim all the way around. And get rid of that excess. And then I just double check. And it looks like I'm on the right track. So now I need my bottle of white school glue. And what I do is run a strip of glue all the way around the hoop on the wooden part. This is the wood part that you're going to be folding your fabric over. Okay, so you don't want so much glue that it's like glopping over the sides, but you want enough that it will hold your fabric in place. And so this is the part that your fingers are going to get a little bit messy. So I'm just folding the edges back, holding it for a second as I move forward. And you can see already that with this glue, once it is wet on the fabric is staying in place where I want it. Some fabrics, if they're thicker, if they're like a home deck fabric, some silk fabrics are all a little trickier to work with, but this does work successfully with the majority of fabrics. And even those that are a little tricky, if you're at this point and it's not holding for you, I'll just use Wonder Clips and I'll clip the edges down while it dries. And then I can take the clips off and it is held perfectly in place. It's a nice strong finish. I don't have to worry about a glue gun burning my fingers with hot glue. So this is definitely my preferred method for finishing a hoop. And then as far as finishing the back, putting something there, I do not do that. I love to see my stitches, or my hoop guts as I call them. I really enjoy seeing that. I don't think they should be covered up. That's a lot of work that went into your project, and it looks super cool. Now, if you do want to gift this and you feel uncomfortable giving it to someone this way and you feel like it just looks unfinished, what you can do is cut a piece of felt, just a plain piece of felt. You can use like pinking shears to give it a nice, like, pretty edge. Cut it to the size of the back of your hoop and just press it into place. Once this glue has dried, you can press it into place and it'll just stay there. So that's another thing that you can do if you want your back to look a little bit more finished. But for me, this is what I love looking at. I'm going to let this dry for a little bit. I'm going to tie a ribbon at the top, but then you are finished. You have finished your faux embroidery crazy quilt with flowers. I'll let this dry and I'll turn it over one last time so we can see what it looks like. Well, here we have two finished hoops. It's kind of cool because we used the same exact pattern for both of them. Well, I used the same exact pattern for this one as I did for this one, but they look like completely different projects. They both look like crazy quilts. They both are beaded, but you can see that just by changing your thread colors, changing your beads, your project will look completely different than the person next to you stitching the same thing. So that's kind of cool. Let's look a little closer at these. So on each of these, we have flowers that we made from the petal beads throughout here. And on this one, we have the larger flowers here. There's such a variety of ways that you can create the flowers with these beads, which is really cool. Then we have our little clump of mushrooms down here. On this side, we did the row of mushrooms. We have the feather stitch throughout with beads attached, just like we did here. The feather stitch. Little, I like to think these are like little tulips almost throughout here. Yeah, I love the color palette of each of them for different reasons. The trims are all really pretty. So I hope you're happy with your project, and I hope you feel like you added to your embroidery knowledge and bank of stitches that you know. And I hope you had fun, because embroidery should be fun. It takes you a while. It's slow stitching for a reason, but it should be really enjoyable and relaxed. And as long as you know the basics, you don't have to follow any rules, which is why it feels relaxed and enjoyable. So there are your finished projects. Tag me in yours. I'd love to see them. You can follow along Wild Boho on Instagram. And happy stitching!